again, welcome. My name is Greg Southern from Deploy Partners. I've been with Deploy Partners for approximately 11 years now. I'm a sales director for Deploy Partners. My background in telecommunications and energy, the utilities sector, particularly energy, focusing on operations and security. History of leading implementations and managing critical solutions for those organizations across global telcos, specifically for their network infrastructure, making sure they're essentially functional, they're performing, and they have automation to help shore up their systems and make sure that everything's operating and giving them the best for the customers. On the call, we have Shane from Red Hat. So he's got a background in military intelligence, supported deployment of private cloud at the Australian Signals Directorate. He's also worked at the ASCSC to codify cybersecurity guidance for Red Hat technologies. Currently works with Australian organizations, helping them to automate and uplift their security posture. So welcome to the session. Shane, can you click to the first slide? So I'll cover a little bit about Deploy Partners. So we founded in 2004. We Deploy Partners, APAC's leading provider for operational management solutions, again across telco, financial services, utilities, and defence. Our headquarters is in Sydney. We've got APAC regional offices in Melbourne, Brisbane, Auckland, Jakarta in Indonesia, and Singapore. So Deploy Partners combines our expertise with best products. We build solutions that resolve complex challenges faced by DevSecOps teams across the region. Our value as a systems integrator is that we provide fast and flexible approaches to putting in solutions for our customers. We also provide 24/7 support to those customers, as well as managed service offerings. Next slide, Shane. All right. So looking at automation and security, really Australia's cybersecurity overview. So last financial year, as it says, Australia's Cybersecurity Centre received 67,000 cybercrime reports and losses for 33 billion. 1,500 reports of these were for malicious cyber activity, and 500 of those were ransomware. A quarter of those attacks were associated with critical infrastructure. So this information really came from a cyber threat report. And what the intent of this report was to highlight the trends and impacts of cybersecurity across a year. And really what we're seeing is that trend from those cyber attacks is, as is in the news all the time, as we're always hearing, the cyber attacks are becoming more frequent, and they're becoming more complex in their nature. Next slide, Shane. And this is where we come to the Essential 8. So the Essential 8, many of you should have heard about by now. It's essentially a baseline set of guidelines that have come out by government, and they're there to protect businesses from cyber incidents and reduce the impact of those incidents should they occur. So organizations that apply these guidelines, essentially what the aim of these is to make it more difficult for your adversaries to actually compromise systems and actually be able to spread throughout your organization. So looking at 2021, New South Wales government came out mandating that organizations should implement and provision maturity assessment against this Essential 8. It's looking likely that the federal government is actually going to be implementing that same mandate as well in the future. So it's going to impact us throughout government, throughout the whole of Australia. And I expect that to be similar adoptions to be taken broader internationally, such as our colleagues over the ditch in New Zealand. So next slide, Shane. So looking at security and automation. So a number of the issues that come across are actually inadvertently breaches from human error and system glitches for pretty much half of the data breaches that we have. And this came out of information in 2019. So what we need to think about is, how do we adopt and apply those essential 8 principles or guidelines in response to these incidents, that really, as our complex nature of our infrastructure grows, moves into more and more of a hybrid cloud model, with more people working from home, accessing our systems remotely, just becomes more and more complicated. And this is really where not adopting an automation approach to security means that you won't be able to keep up effectively with all the challenges that you're going to be faced with from a security perspective. Okay, next slide. So security automation, what does it cover? Really to look at 3 main areas that it's going to look to assist you. First one is to look at your operational risk. So it allows you to provide consistency to your configuration. So ensuring that your policies that you decide for your various applications, your infrastructure, configuration of those are all compliant and all the same across the organization. It's able to do that a lot faster. So where we look at our DevSecOps, it's able to, the automation is making you more efficient. You can apply the same policies across your broad infrastructure a lot faster than you would be doing on a manual day-to-day basis. And ultimately, all of that leads to a reduction in your operational costs, reducing the number of people that you actually have doing that work, reducing potentially the incidents that may happen in the event of you not actually doing that work and you having some sort of data breach. So that's a bit of an introduction to essentially the concept of the Red Hat automation. I'll move it over to Shane on the next slide, and he'll actually take us through some demonstration and some material.
Absolutely. And thanks, Greg, for that excellent introduction to security automation. So hi, everyone. I'm Shane. I'm a solution architect at Red Hat, focusing on security. So far in today's session, we've looked at some of those trends in cyber threats impacting Australian organizations, and some of the ways you can present a hardened target to those threats, adopting that Essential 8 baseline and being able to support automating that framework. We've also looked at the value of security automation, creating consistency, removing human error from practices and processes and mitigating risk, and also looking at accelerating DevSecOps adoption. So in this part of the presentation, I want to look at some of those specific challenges facing organizations and how they can use a security automation framework to address these. Now, the first challenge that I wanted to look at is ransomware. And I'm going to look closely at ransomware because it gets a special mention in the Australian Cybersecurity Centre annual threat report that Greg highlighted. So over the last financial year, the ACSC observed a 15% increase in ransomware attacks. And that was about 500 reports over that period. But what we also know about ransomware attacks is that they're more costly than other types of data breaches. So this statistic here, $4.62 million as the average total cost of a ransomware breach, is taken from a report called the IBM Total Cost of a Data Breach report. Now, what I find really interesting about this figure is that it doesn't actually account for any ransoms paid by organizations. This figure, 4.62 million, purely accounts for the cost of escalation, notification, lost business, and response. So even when we don't account for any ransoms paid by organizations, ransomware attacks are more costly than other types of breaches. And that's why we want to focus on that a little bit today. What we're also starting to see is those ransomware threat actors changing their tactics, techniques, and procedures. So this is some reporting from late last year, looking at a ransomware threat group starting to expand their target base, looking to move to cloud systems, and in this case, Linux systems, and start to target mission-critical data. Now, this was an experimental variant of this ransomware type that was discovered. It didn't support all of the execution options as the Windows variant, but it did represent a clear strategy from ransomware threat groups that they're starting to broaden targets and starting to target that mission critical data. So how can organizations present a hardened target to ransomware threat groups? And one way they can do that is with application control. So application control is one of the ACSC's Essential 8 mitigation strategies. And essentially, it's allow listing known processes, creating a baseline of activity on my systems, and then enforcing that baseline. So I know exactly what's executing on my system, and I can prevent unwanted malware like ransomware executing and potentially locking or extorting my data. So application control is critically important to system security, and the Australian Signals Directorate recognises it as one of the most effective mitigation strategies in ensuring the security of systems. So why do we still see organisations caught out by ransomware and other threats? And I think one of the reasons is that application control is difficult to scale. I can easily create an application control baseline for a single system, and I can enforce that and make changes to it. But how do I scale that across the hybrid cloud? How do I support application control, not only on premises, but also for my cloud workloads? So security automation provides us that framework to scale application control, that critical security strategy. So we can take, in this case, open source technologies that support allow listing, and we can create automated workflows, not only to create that initial application control baseline, but to make changes to that in a controlled, consistent, and scalable way. So this approach to automating application control also mitigates the risk of human error. I'm applying those changes in a controlled and consistent way, and I'm mitigating the risk that an error could lead to ransomware executing on my system. One of the other challenges facing organizations is update management. And I thought that this statistic from the Pond Institute was really interesting. So it's taken from respondents in a study that were targeted by a data breach. And these respondents indicated that they knew they were vulnerable before the breach to a vulnerability and that a patch existed, but they didn't take any action. So 60% of organizations knew they were vulnerable, they knew a patch was available, but they didn't take any action and were subsequently breached. So we know that patching is critically important. And in the ACSC annual cyber threat report that Greg highlighted, it's indicated that threat actors were able to turn vulnerabilities into exploits in a number of hours. So essentially they monitored security vulnerability reporting. As soon as a vulnerability was reported, they turned that into an exploit and started scanning vulnerable internet connected systems and attempting to exploit them. So if patches are available and we know that threat actors are targeting these vulnerabilities, why do organizations get caught out? And I think one of those reasons is that enterprise patch management is complex and time consuming. So this is a look at a typical enterprise patch management process. And you can see that it doesn't just involve applying a patch. I might need to initially perform a system health check and see if I can even update that system. I might need to perform a backup of that host, in this case, snapshotting that host through vSphere, for example, scheduling the removal of that snapshot also. Installing those patches, performing some verification testing to ensure that that patch was successful and all my business processes are up and running. And then finally, being able to roll back if an error is encountered. If that patch isn't successful, I need to bring that business application or business process back online and recover. So for a lot of organizations, this same manual process is being repeated at a scale of hundreds or even thousands of devices and servers. But given it's a prescriptive process with really clear outcomes, it's a great use case for security automation. So what I can start to do is automate that process. I can automate those health checks and I can create incidents if an issue is encountered. I can automate the backup of that server before I start patching. I can apply those updates in a consistent, controlled way using automation. I can automate my verification testing and ensure that all of those business processes are back online successfully. And if an issue is encountered, I can automatically roll back that server and roll back that patch and bring those business processes back online and do a bit more investigation as to what's happening with that particular server. So in this case, we can automate applying those patches, pulling through critical security vulnerabilities as quickly as possible, and being able to move faster than those threat groups. So what I wanted to look at today was a quick demonstration of what automated patching can look like. So we're going to look at a new critical vulnerability being reported. And what I'm going to do is identify my risk exposure. I'm going to find all of the impacted systems across my environment that are affected by that vulnerability. What I'm then going to do is use an automated process to mitigate that vulnerability. What you're going to see in the demonstration is that a patch isn't actually available, but I'm going to automate a series of steps to mitigate that vulnerability while we wait for a patch to be available and that we can apply. And I'm going to perform that automation using Red Hat Ansible. So let's take a look at that process now. So in this case, the security vulnerability I'm going to look at was recently reported. It's called the PwnKit vulnerability, and it's a vulnerability in the Polkit package of Red Hat systems that potentially allows an attacker to gain local privilege escalation. So where I can find information about that is through the Red Hat Security Bulletin. So here I'm going to search for Red Hat and that vulnerability name. And the first link I'm going to see is to the Red Hat Security Bulletin. Now, this is where I can find a lot of information about this vulnerability. I can find a description, I can find the impacted systems, I can get some technical details and some mitigation steps I can take to prevent my exposed systems being exploited. But what I'm really interested in is this link up the top to view the exposed systems inside my organization. So if I click that link, I'm going to be taken across to Red Hat Insights. So this is a Red Hat platform. It's provided at no cost with every Red Hat Enterprise Linux subscription. And it allows me to be able to visualize where I'm exposed across my environment to vulnerabilities and take action to remediate those. So here I can see all of those exposed systems across my environment. What I'm going to do is just select that first system. This is an AWS server, and I'm presented with that option to remediate it. Now, when I select that remediate option, the platform's going to create a set of automated steps that I can apply to this system and prevent it being exploited by that vulnerability. So I'm just going to give this playbook a name. I'm going to call it EC2 PwnKit Remediate. And I can start reviewing those systems we're going to apply. I mentioned at the start of this demonstration that a patch currently wasn't available for this when I created this demonstration. So instead, I've got a mitigation I can apply to that system, a set of steps, automated steps that we can work through and be able to mitigate that system. Now, if I was going to attempt to manually mitigate all of these systems, there's probably 12 or so steps I need to apply to be able to mitigate that. And if I'm doing that manually, I run the risk of introducing error in each of those steps. So this allows me to take an automated approach to remove human error from that process and be able to mitigate the risk of introducing an additional vulnerability here. So I'm just going to click through the rest of these menus. We're just going to validate those actions. We'll identify that, yes, we're performing this mitigation through this system. And then we'll be able to create that Ansible playbook. Now, once the Ansible playbook is created, I can launch that across my infrastructure using Red Hat Ansible. So this is the Red Hat Ansible automation platform and allows me to take those playbooks and to run those across my environment. So being able to pull down those playbooks from my insights platform, run that as a set of automated steps across my environment. Now I'm going to step forward a little bit here, and we'll just look at how we can combine all of that automation together. So what I'm creating here is what's called a template for automation. I'm going to bring together that playbook with my automated mitigation steps. I'm going to bring together the servers I want to run that against. I'm going to provide some credentials, which in this case I don't have access to, but I can specify that I can run those across the environment. And then I'm going to launch this automation. And once this starts, we'll be able to see that I'll have a set of steps that are being performed across all the systems in my environment. So the last thing to do here is to enable privilege escalation, and then save that automation. And now I can simply launch that. So all of that automation has been provided to me by Red Hat, and I can start using that across my environment. And this is where Red Hat and Deploy partners can come together to integrate this into your environment. What does this workflow look like inside your environment? What are the additional steps you need to take, the automated verification testing, the backup and recovery using the existing investments inside your environment? So what you can see here is that automation has started. We've started applying all of those steps provided by Red Hat. We're installing System Tap, we're providing those scripts, and then finally we're registering this system back with Red Hat and specifying that it's been mitigated. So what you saw there was a brief demonstration of an automated patching workflow. I was able to identify the systems exposed in my environment using Red Hat Insights. And then I used Red Hat Insights also to create a set of automated steps to mitigate that vulnerability inside my environment. And the final step there was using Red Hat Ansible Automation Platform to launch that automation, run those set of steps across the servers I've specified, and mitigate that vulnerability for all of the servers identified within my environment. So today we've looked at the Essential 8 and how it provides that baseline we can use to present a hardened target to cyber threats. We've also looked at security automation and how it helps us to adopt these strategies in a consistent and scalable way. And looking at removing human error from those processes. I looked at that patching example where I can introduce human error at every step and potentially introduce risk into my patching processes. And automation provides me a way to remove that human error and look at consistent approaches. We also looked closely at security automation today and some of those examples of application control and how security automation helps me to scale that critical security mitigation strategy across hybrid cloud environments. We also looked at the importance of those automated patching workflows and how I can use security automation to pull through critical security patches as quickly as possible inside my environment. So we talked about that risk of human error, and I think that this statistic is telling. So this was a study looking at organizations and how they support network device configuration. What we saw here was 68% of organizations in this study were still making manual changes to network devices. So making a mistake here, introducing human error, would provide that initial access that a threat actor needs, exposing a system to the internet that isn't designed to be, potentially allowing that access and allowing them to move laterally within the organization. So automation helps us to mitigate that risk and introduce consistency to changes. So I'm just going to hand back to Greg and the team now.
Great, thanks, Shane. Really good overview, really good demonstration. Appreciate you taking us through that. Hope everyone enjoyed that. I suppose one of the things that we want to know is, do you have any questions for us? So we can open up the panel. You can either put them through the chat I think, don't think you can unmute yourself. So if you want to put questions in the chat, I can add in a question here as a bit of food for thought. So what would your first step be if you're thinking about your own organization, and how you would adopt security automation into that? Maybe what are your main challenges you have around keeping on top with all your security challenges, just from a people perspective, a resource perspective, and the changing environments that we have. Give a few minutes to come up with some thoughts.
And yeah, I guess that's a question I see come up frequently, Greg, is what is the first thing I can do, the first step I can take to adopting security automation? And I think it helps in the first instance to really have an understanding of what are the top risks to your environment, and how are there any manual steps or manual processes identified with those risks that you can start to remove. So for example, we looked at that patching workflow, certainly lots of potential to remove human error from that process and introduce automation. And also application control, making manual changes to application control baselines could potentially allow a script to execute that isn't designed to be, and introduce malware to that system.
Thanks, Shane. I can't see any questions coming in, unless I'm missing something. So thank you everybody for listening.